Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. We are going to give everyone a couple minutes to log on, and we will start at 10:02. All right, it's 10:02. Again, hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. I'd like to introduce today's speakers, Andy Greenberg and Rick Moy. Rick is a high-tech business leader with over 27 years of experience in cybersecurity ventures, including product testing, intrusion prevention, antivirus, and content filtering, and is actively involved in the tech community. He currently resides as the Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Tempered, the creators of Airwall. Andy is a senior writer for Wired, comes with over 14 years of experience covering security, privacy, and information freedom. He's also the author of the book Sandworm, A New Era of Cyber War and the Hunt for the Kremlin's Most Dangerous Hackers. During the webinar, please note on the side panel where you may submit questions during the call. Andy and Rick will be monitoring questions as they come through. Please also note that the webinar is being recorded. Once you receive the recorded version of this call, please share your thoughts via social platforms and networks. Rick and Andy, thanks for joining us today.
Very glad to be here.
Thank you, Haley, for the intro, and thanks, Andy. Really pleased to be talking with you. I think this marks the 10-year. 10 years ago, we became acquainted right after I had left ESET and had started a product security testing firm called NSS Labs, and was really looking at the asymmetric nature of the cyber attacks that were going on and what defenders could do to protect themselves. And so here we are, 10 years later, 2020. The world's evolved and changed, and you've released just a fantastic book, which I thoroughly enjoyed reading, and I think does a great job of painting the picture. And I know that you've done a ton of research, even flying out to Eastern Europe and really connecting the dots. But in your book headline, it talks about in 2014 how we started to see some things changing, attacks against NATO electric grids in the U.S. And elsewhere, but that wasn't really the start of it, right? So I want to hand it over to you and just kind of tell us how you got started in this and try to piece together the timeline for us.
Yeah. Well, can we switch to the screen where we can see each other's faces? I'm somehow stuck on the title screen here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Yeah. Good to see you virtually, Rick. Yeah, I think we met first in Vegas a decade ago. How times have definitely changed with all of that whole hacker summer camp having been virtual and now seeing you virtually again. But I really appreciate the chance to be here. You were asking. How did I come to this story? I think,
yeah.
And yeah, my editors at Wired basically asked me to find the big story of cyber war, and this was in 2016, when I think every news editor at least was thinking about the Russian interference in the presidential election of that year, and they saw that as cyber war. I think that's what they wanted me to basically like find a big magazine feature to write about. But to me, that didn't seem like cyber war at all. It had been even described in congressional hearings as like a kind of digital Pearl Harbor moment. I think just because it was a kind of strategic surprise, but it wasn't like cyber war as I always have envisioned it, where state-sponsored hackers are using cyber attacks to actually just break stuff, to destroy the infrastructure, or at least to attack the civilian infrastructure of an enemy, of an adversary country. And so I went looking for that kind of real cyber war. My former colleague Kim Zetter, who had written for Wired in 2016, she left the company around then. She had written an amazing piece about the first ever blackout triggered by hackers, which happened in Ukraine. And so that to me is the kind of quintessential act of cyber war, like a hacker-induced blackout. And so I went looking deeper in Ukraine and really found there that there was much more than just that one cyber attack. There was a whole series of them that had hit every part of Ukrainian society, from banks to government agencies, and then finally the utilities, with these data destructive attacks that wiper malware that only in December of that year 2015 had climaxed with the first ever blackout attack. So that to me did seem like a kind of cyber war unfolding. And then just as I was looking into it, it happened again. In December 2016, there was a second blackout attack. So I could see now that in fact, this, although I was kind of late to this story, it was still unfolding. And, right. And I could get in there and tell it. I actually started, before I even went to Ukraine, by talking to the kind of threat intelligence community who had been following these attacks and trying to attribute them. And I talked to FireEye, who had found this group of hackers. It was actually their subsidiary Eyesight Partners, who they acquired later, had found this group of apparently Russian hackers hitting all of these NATO targets, as you said, across Europe and Eastern Europe. And but then as Eyesight had looked closer, this was back in 2014, I should say, as when Eyesight first found this group of activity, they saw that these hackers were actually doing reconnaissance for attacks on ICS systems, on industrial control systems. And not only that, but they had planted, it soon became clear, the same malware known as Black Energy, this kind of reconnaissance, all-purpose Trojan, in the US power grid as well. So that's when I knew that this was not going to just be a story about Ukraine. It wasn't going to be like this foreign case study. This was a group of hackers that were literally, before they turned out the power in Ukraine, they had planted the same seeds to do it in the US. And a kind of key point is that the malware, that they were planting, Black Energy, each sample of it had a different reference to the science fiction novel Dune. So FireEye had named this group Sandworm in reference to this kind of monster in Dune, these massive 1,000-foot-long worms that lie beneath the surface of the desert and then occasionally rise up to do these terribly destructive things. So that turned out to be like an incredibly, appropriate name. And
yeah, it's a great metaphor for, the computers on our desk, right? From the IT world that, have been posing a risk for a long time. And now, we realize, well, those computers are plugged into our walls, which are, getting power from the electrical grid. So it's like following that cord all the way back to the source of what keeps literally our lights and our computers on.
Right. But I mean, to me, though, it represented like, that's another way to think of it, I think. But like, I saw it as like this monster that's invisible that occasionally rises out and like from the surface unexpectedly and inflicts some catastrophe, which turns out was exactly what Sandworm would be, with that first blackout attack and the second blackout attack. And then ultimately more cyber, a kind of climactic cyber attack that I think we'll get to, that spread around the world and is the reason that I wrote this book.
Yeah. So I have a picture, maybe good time to share that. Let me just flip over here for a second. So, talk to us about this image here.
So this is a photo I took with my iPhone in early 2017 when I finally managed to get to Ukraine to sort of like report on the ground, to try to reconstruct what had happened in these attacks. This is the control room of Prikarpatia Oblenergo, which is like the Western Ukrainian electric utility that had been hardest hit in that first blackout attack in December of 2015. And I talked to all of these operators in this utility, and I found this kind of incredible thing about Ukrainians, which is that unlike pretty much any other victims of cyber attacks anywhere in the world, they were very eager to tell me every detail of what had happened to them. And what had happened to this company was just incredibly brutal. They'd been, I think that the reason they wanted to talk, of course, is because they were facing an actual physical war with Russia that the world was kind of ignoring. And so they would do anything they could to bring more attention to their victimization, really. But in that utility, Sandworm had hit them with a wiper malware. It had used this phantom mouse attack to manually take over their mouse movements on their screens. And one of these operators even shared with me a video of this, where they were locked out of their computer and had to watch as their own mouse clicked through circuit breakers to open them and turn off the power to 250,000 Ukrainian civilians. Then the backup power was turned off to the company itself so that they were thrown into a blackout too. Then they were bombarded with fake phone calls. It was just like kind of insult to injury, one thing after another. One of the most brutal kind of sustained cyber attacks I've ever heard of.
Yeah, so one of the 250,000 people, that was, that sounds like a lot, but then maybe from American standards, how big is that? But one of the things you talk about in, that's a lot of people losing power. This was what for about an hour or two. What was
that was for only 6 hours. And in the second blackout attack, which hit a year later in the capital of Kyiv, it hit only a fraction of the city, and it only lasted 1 hour. So in a way, like, the mystery of these attacks was like, what is this all about? Like, why go to these efforts just to cause these short blackouts? In a way, I think that these were not like the main events of Sandworm's attacks.
Right.
They were demonstrations, they were experiments, they were sorry?
They were live tests, right?
Yes, exactly. And Ukraine, ultimately the conclusion that I came to, and I wrote this in a big cover story for Wired. The first thing I finally wrote about all of this, the thing I delivered to my editors, was this piece whose thesis was essentially that Ukraine is being used as a test laboratory for cyber war, that Russia is trying things out there. They're seeing what they can get away with. They're seeing what they can do technically. But that what happens in Ukraine should not be ignored, because these same capabilities can be used against us. And this cyber war in Ukraine is bound to spill out to the rest of the world sooner or later.
Yeah, I think it's probably interesting to note that Ukraine actually means, the meaning of it is a border land, right?
Well, it's interesting. Like, that is the Russian interpretation of the etymology of Ukraina, like the name of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Since publishing the book, I've got a lot of Ukrainians angry with me who say that is Russia's interpretation of the word, and that they have a different interpretation of what the root of Ukraina means, and it just means like our homeland. But this is debated even inside of Ukraine. It's like it turns out that it's a really controversial topic. And in the paperback of the book, I had to kind of amend it to be sensitive. But yeah, like, Ukraine, regardless of what its name means, it is this borderland. It's always been abused by Russia, and we in the West, have always ignored that. We've treated Ukraine as kind of Russia's sphere of influence. And in this case, I was trying to warn people in that first story that is, that's not how cyber war works, that we are also on the same border with Russia on the internet. There is no geographic distance to defend us. So, and then that piece that I'm talking about came out ultimately. I'm sorry if I'm getting ahead of of you here, but
no, let's go.
That cover story came out the very week that NotPetya hits. In fact, the day that this magazine was being delivered to people's mailboxes, we began to see NotPetya strike in Ukraine and spread around the world. But we can come back to what, I don't know if you want to get to NotPetya yet.
You went there. I mean, I say it is rare that, a writer or journalist's predictions come true the day they publish.
It's definitely not what you want. Like, you want to people digest your prediction for at least 24 hours before it comes true.
So to that point, there's been a progression, right, and an evolution of the attacks that have been performed by this Sandworm group. Maybe we can talk about that for a minute before jumping into the NotPetya.
Yeah, right. So the real evolution that I was seeing when I was writing that first piece and when I was in Ukraine for the first time was that in the second blackout attack, it was. This only kind of became clear over a series of months as I talked to different researchers. Ukrenergo, the national utility of Ukraine, was hit at their transmission station in northern Kyiv, and they couldn't really tell me what had happened, but they did. The operator on duty described to me seeing all of the lights on the control panel just flip from red to green, meaning that the power was being turned off on circuit breakers just in machine gun fashion, just faster than he could possibly respond. And it would turn out that that attack was carried out with a piece of automated malware. It was kind of the opposite of what had happened the year before with this manual clicking through circuit breakers on the poor operator's screen, the phantom mouse. This was fully automated. This was a piece of malware which has come to be known as in-destroyer or crash override. And it was only the second piece of malware ever since Stuxnet to actually directly send commands to physical equipment to directly interact with industrial control systems. And it was able to turn off the power very quickly, but as I said, it only caused a 1 hour blackout. And that was kind of a mystery, why build this brilliant, piece of malware, like a Stuxnet-like thing, just for a 1 hour blackout. And that mystery, I didn't actually even manage to solve it, honestly, before the book came out. It only came to light, the answer came to light just before the book was published. It was too late to even include this in the hardcover edition. But Joe Slowick at Dragos came up with this kind of new analysis of what had happened in that attack and what the real intentions were. And what his theory is, because there is this little component of crash override and destroyer, that blackout malware, that was designed to attack protective relays, these kind of safety devices on a power grid. They monitor for unsafe conditions, and they'll open a circuit breaker automatically to try to prevent unsafe overloads of current and things like that. And the attackers in this case had a little exploit that they could use, put those to sleep. And what Joe Slowick at Dragos found in this kind of re-analysis of postmortem of that 2016 attack was that the intention was to turn off the power, open all the circuit breakers, then put those protective relay safeguards to sleep, so that when the operators themselves were scrambling to turn the power back on, they wouldn't know that they had no safety net, they had no safety systems, and they could have, in their rush to turn the power back on. Yeah, this is a protective relay, exactly, the Siemens Cybertech device, and this is the exact one that Sandworm had an exploit for built into their blackout malware, basically. So the idea was that when the operators rushed to turn the power back on, they wouldn't know that they didn't have these working, and then they themselves would burn their lines or blow up transformers, or even maybe cause physical harm to their staff. I mean, it was a really insidious attack, and
sparks would fly, right? And causing
kind of,
you have to repair, not just turn it back on.
And this was definitely I would say it turns out this was not just the only attack since Stuxnet to directly try to disrupt physical equipment. It was the only attack since Stuxnet to try to destroy it. It turns out this was an attempt at physical destruction by digital means, which was new. I mean, since Stuxnet, we'd never seen anyone but the U.S. and Israel try this before, and it was very scary. It only failed, in fact, because of a little misconfiguration in that Siemens Cybertech exploit that caused the devices to stay online. So when I didn't actually know that at the time, but I could see that there was real escalation and innovation happening. Sandworm was doing things in Ukraine that no one was doing anywhere else in the world.
Good point. And actually, just in terms of the calendar, Stuxnet takes us back to 2010, right? The now well understood joint operation between the U.S. and Israel with the intent of slowing down the Iranian nuclear program under Obama, right? So there's definitely a precedent for political activation of a cyber offensive program.
Yeah, I think so. And in this book, I try not to let the U.S. Western intelligence agencies off the hook here, because in some ways we opened this Pandora's box with Stuxnet. We in the U.S., our government demonstrated what was possible to Russia and everyone else. But I do want to be clear that Stuxnet was an incredibly targeted attack. It was designed so carefully just to destroy these nuclear enrichment centrifuges in Natanz to prevent the creation of a weapon. Whereas Crash Override in Destroyer, this automated blackout malware, was designed to just turn off the power to any civilian company, to civilian users of electricity, totally indiscriminately, a kind of cyber warfare that I don't think that the U.S. I don't know. I wouldn't say that we wouldn't do it, because we absolutely are maintaining the capability to do it. And we're, when I speak to policymakers in both the Trump and Obama administration, they don't want to rein in that ability, but it's not something we've ever done. And I think it's what makes Russia so different is just how willing they are to use these capabilities.
Yep. Indeed. I want to go back and talk about the Ukrainian energy utility, and maybe two questions bundled in. Just how modern were they in their protections, and their what were best practices there versus maybe elsewhere, and because we have this notion of the term air gap to keep things that are potentially very explosive and powerful off of the electronic grid. To what extent were things air gapped back then? Obviously not enough to prevent this kind of an incident, but what was the reality that you found in your research there?
Well, I think to the kind of initial implication, the first response from a lot of U.S. officials when this happened in 2015 actually was like, oh, well, that's Ukraine. They don't secure their stuff properly. Of course, they're practically a developing country. But when I spoke to the people who did the analysis of that 2015 attack, like Rob Lee, who was a former NSA, critical infrastructure threat hunter, he didn't agree. He thought that, the Prekarpatye Oblenergo had taken a lot of precautions. They, of course, as you were getting at, they did not have an air gap, and neither would Ukrenergo in 2016, the second blackout attack. Mm-hmm. In both cases, there were connections that allowed the hackers to get past, not with any kind of clever USB drive plugged into an air gap machine or something. But I don't think that is unique to Ukraine. In fact, the more that I write about industrial control system security, the more I realize that this notion of an air gap is practically a myth. It just does not truly exist, except in a few limited situations, like nuclear generation. It seems is actually regulated to the degree that there are real air gaps. Intelligence agencies have real air gaps, but I don't believe that the average. I don't know. I am told. I'm not inside of these places, but I talk to the incident responders and threat intelligence people who are, and it just doesn't sound like in the U.S. we have these air gaps either in the kind of distribution or transmission stations that were hit in Ukraine. And in fact, in some ways, Ukraine was better off than we would be, because we depend on automation in these systems in a way that a country with more antiquated tech like Ukraine does not. When they were hit in 2015 actually, they had a lot of staff in trucks just drive out and manually flip the switches to turn the power back on, to close those circuit breakers. And they are accustomed to doing that. They have a more manual process. They have more blackouts, and they're more accustomed to dealing with them. We depend on the internet and automated systems much more than Ukraine does, and that actually leaves us more vulnerable.
They had the analog to fall back on, and we're used to that.
Exactly. And that would be like a kind of theme that I found in Ukraine a lot. Like, I'm sorry, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but eventually these attacks would hit the postal system too, and take out practically every computer they had. But in Ukraine, the postal system can work with paper-based accounting alone. And I don't know if we could do that in the US, like ahead of a, for instance, mail-in ballot election.
Right.
That's the kind of thing that starts to trouble me.
I think it's probably a good segue into Pablo and the NotPetya story, right? How
right.
an average citizen in Ukraine, shown here, who talked to you, was severely impacted, right? So this is we're talking about industrial control systems, hacking, but tell us how Pablo was involved as a citizen, and how this all got to be the largest financially impactful cyber attack in history.
Yeah. Okay. So to start, so Pablo is he's an IT administrator at the Ukrainian Ministry of Health, just to set the stage. So NotPetya began to spread that same, practically the same day that my Ukrainian cover story came out, and we began to see this ransomware screen appear on computers across Ukraine and then the world. It turns out that it wasn't really ransomware. That was just a ruse. It was a piece of destructive malware that was spreading, that had been seeded out through the hijacked software updates of a piece of Ukrainian accounting software that anyone who does business in Ukraine has to have. And then it spread with this these intertwined exploits. One stolen from the NSA called Eternal Blue, one that is kind of an open source thing that everybody has access to called Mimikatz, for stealing credentials and reusing them.
And it just out of memory, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it just spreads like wildfire across first the entire nation of Ukraine. So Pablo, I tell his story in the book, among other folks, because I think it's just very human and representative of the human experience of this massive global cyber attack. So he was working in the Ministry of Health when he began to hear and read reports on and get text messages about the fact that NotPetya was just eating alive the entire Ukrainian internet. Every government agency was getting taken off and down by this. 22 banks, hundreds of companies in total in Ukraine were just having essentially all of their computers destroyed in a matter of seconds in many cases. He immediately recommended to the Minister of Health that they just pull their whole network offline. And in doing so, I think he actually did manage to save a lot of their very sensitive health data from destruction, and spent the rest of the day kind of trying to grapple with this problem of how do you deal with the fact that you can't really have any network connections. But then at 6 p.m. he left the office to go home, and I think it's probably nothing for him to do, really. I mean, the Ukrainian internet had been just carpet bombed, and he tried to get on the subway, found that his contactless payment system to swipe into the subway didn't work. It had been taken out by NotPetya. So he went out to try to get some cash to buy a physical token to get on the subway, found that all the ATMs in the neighborhood were down. He had to walk to another neighborhood and find one ATM with his long line and to get enough cash, just enough to buy a token. He went on the subway to his home neighborhood, tried to buy groceries, thinking I better buy some milk and bread as this disaster unfolds, and found that the point of sale systems in the grocery store were down. He didn't have enough cash to buy groceries. He had to go back out and found that all the ATMs in this neighborhood were down. And it was just, as he described it to me, like a kind of end of the world scenario. He just felt, he actually said that he felt like he was missing a limb, which was, I thought, very telling, this way that he was disoriented by this, that it was his way of interacting with the world was broken. And I think that was we talk a lot in the cyber. I think we try not to talk as much as we used to in the cybersecurity industry about cyber 9/11, cyber Pearl Harbor. But this is the closest thing that I have seen to that. This was an actual, to use the Die Hard metaphor, a fire sale of a whole country. Like it took down like just so many of their systems. But then of course it did not in Ukraine. It spread to the rest of the world too.
So I've seen quotes somewhere, I don't know if it was in your book, but up to 10% of Ukrainian systems in Ukraine were taken offline.
Right.
And just to draw some relationship, the Linkos group, which made the ME-DOC software in Ukraine, was kind of the equivalent to the American Intuit, who makes the TurboTax, right?
Absolutely.
So
poor Linkos group. I mean, like, not only was that the kind of perfect vector to infect not just everyone in Ukraine, but everyone who does business in Ukraine, but they were also hit by this, and this little family-run company that makes this accounting software, a very nice success story of a company. Like, they were decimated by this. They were not just decimated. That means 1 in 10 computers. They were actually like wiped out by this and took weeks to recover themselves. Not to mention the reputational damage of like having in themselves the patient zero for this global attack.
Right, and the SWAT team, the Ukrainian SWAT team, rushing in to confiscate the.
Yeah, a week later, like the Ukrainian police, like in these militarized uniforms with, semi-automatic rifles, like basically raided them, ran up the stairs, the guns that people kicked down a door just to grab the update server that had been the so-called source of this attack. But of course, they were just the victim too. They had just
exactly
just a hot point essentially for Sandworm.
And there's so many threads we can pull here, right? Because and this one is potentially hashtag government relationship with responsible cyber citizens / cyber researchers who our government and others haven't always been had a as productive a relationship, right? It's been a bit of an evolutionary thing, I think, to be generically nice about it.
And I think that the cybersecurity community of like private sector and research and academia in Ukraine doesn't have a lot of nice things to say about the government's network defenders, to be frank. Like, I mean, Ukrainians have a lot of complaints about their government, and this is not an exception.
There's something that unites humanity across the globe, isn't there?
Sure. Yeah. Can't say that we are free from sin either. Yeah.
No, we have that, but I think the cooperation's moving in the right direction these days. And there's certainly it's an evolutionary thing, but it's been hard to wear the to identify as a hacker and have a certain view of that as that's there's white and black, but the lack of understanding for that subculture that I have one foot in personally, and a lot of friends that are hardcore researchers. I think they just want to see that get a lot better because they're here to help, right? And
yeah, and I think that the U.S. is figuring that out, like with some exceptions. Like we still see confusion and like missteps, like. I think well, anyway, I don't want to get into off on a tangent criticizing like the U.S. Government's treatment of hackers, but I think we've come a long way, and we've come a long way compared to Ukraine, where they're really just still figuring this stuff out, and where they've had to like figure it out in a trial by fire because they're facing waves of attacks of the kind that we've never seen in the U.S.
Yeah, no, and I think the public-private partnerships that have been rising up over the last 5 to 10 years have made a big difference. But it just goes to show any tool that's kind of created wants to be free, right, in some way or another, right? A contractor is going to take it home and do some work, or it's going to get in the hands of activists. So
right.
Once you create that thing, once you open Pandora's box, so to speak, it'll wander out, and it's hard to put that back in the box, as I think you covered.
Right. I mean, I think you're referring to Eternal Blue being integrated into NotPetya. I think the Eternal Blue was kind of it was like a little bonus, like supercharge for NotPetya. I would say the most damaging part of NotPetya was actually Mimikatz, that allowed it to spread the most virulently. and that is like a white hat hacking tool, or I don't know. It's like it's out there for penetration testers in theory, but it's incredibly powerful. But yeah, I don't want to like let the NSA off the hook here. They lost control of an extremely powerful hacking tool. I mean, the U.S. government in general, there's like several points to criticize them on in this story. I think most of all is that everything that I've described so far in the Ukrainian cyber war generated no response from the American government. The U.S. government, up until this point in the story, and further, just didn't say anything to Russia. Didn't even tell them, we know what you're doing, please cut it out. Maybe please don't turn off the power to civilians, like don't cause blackouts in a neighboring country.
Mm-hmm.
The US government said none of that, nothing. And I think that was an enormous missed opportunity. But it only became more obvious that it was as NotPetya continued to spread, including onto American soil, like hitting American companies and causing them hundreds of millions of dollars of damage.
Yeah, let's actually. I think there's more to talk about there in that respect. And I have an image, that you shared with me out your office window in New York that speaks to puts a face on just the type of impact that the NotPetya had.
Yeah. So this is what you're showing is the Newark terminal for EPM terminals, which is Maersk owns APM. This is one of Maersk's ports, essentially. Maersk is the world's largest shipping firm. It's based in Copenhagen, but I focused on their Newark terminal in part just because, like you said, I could see it out my office window in One World Trade Center in Manhattan. And by talking to some brave sources inside of Maersk, because Maersk never willingly told me this story, but anonymous people inside of the company did. I was able to reconstruct what happened to Maersk on this day of NotPetya, June 27, 2017. And what that looked like was that at this terminal, for instance, this is the terminal where like ships the size of the Empire State Building on its side arrive carrying tens of thousands of cargo containers, another Empire State Building's worth of cargo on top of them. And on this day, nobody could figure out how to unload those ships. Like the inventory systems were wiped. And then the gates to that terminal, which is kind of like the check-in point where 18-wheeler trucks pull up carrying a container, they're told over this voice over IP system where to go to pick up or drop off a container. That was dead, and the gate was locked. And trucks began to line up by the hundreds, just in Newark, like a line that went miles long. And Maersk couldn't even send these poor truck drivers an email to tell them what was happening. It was just a state of total confusion. Eventually, they're all told, like, by the port police, you got to find somewhere else to send your cargo today. And this is stuff that's like part of just-in-time supply chains, perishable goods that have to be refrigerated. That if they send on another line, there's like a huge premium they have to pay. So this is a disaster, but it's like not just a Newark, New Jersey disaster. This same thing was happening at 17 of Maersk's terminals in ports in the world, from California to Newark to Algeciras in Spain to the Netherlands to Mumbai. 17 terminals. This is like a global fiasco. Nobody had ever dealt with anything like this before in just shipping alone. And then you have to like imagine that the same kind of disaster with real physical world consequences was also playing out at Merck, the pharmaceutical company, who couldn't even manufacture drugs. They had to borrow their own human papillomavirus from the CDC. It was happening at FedEx, who ultimately lost $400 million. It was happening at Mondelez, which owned Cadbury and Nabisco, and they like lost the ability to like make chocolate at some factories. And this was,
it's a different kind of tragedy, the loss of chocolate.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to like overplay that. I mean, I should say like this is just like the financial. This is all like a massive disruption with huge financial consequences. Ultimately adding up to $10 billion in damage, by far the biggest cyber attack we've ever heard of in financial consequences.
Mm.
But it also hit hospitals too, and that's a kind of damage that can't be quantified in the same way. If you want to get into that.
I do. I think right before we jump into that, though, it's amazing that the destruction spreads so quickly because all of the systems, for example, at Maersk were online. It went after the domain controllers and bricking those. And I think I want to cover that point where basically they were all destroyed except for one.
I can tell the story.
Which happened to be offline,
Right.
in a funny kind of way. I think that's an interesting air gap story, if you will.
Yeah, it is in a way. So Maersk, as you were getting at, their entire network was just destroyed. They actually had one instance of MEDOC installed, this Ukrainian accounting software in Odessa, and that was enough for their entire network to be, infected and taken down. Just one, yeah, and that included all of their domain controllers. And they domain controller, as I'm sure this audience knows, is kind of the backbone of an IT network. If you don't, it's very difficult to rebuild a whole network if you don't have your domain controllers. And in fact, they realized very quickly they did not have a single backup of a domain controller, which is just kind of flabbergasting. But that's because they had this redundancy system where the domain controllers would back up to each other, so that if you lost one or even even 50, you would have more. They would just be copied to each other all the time. Right. But they had not planned for a situation where all of them would be wiped at once. And so they had none. They had no backup of the domain controller. This is a total catastrophe. They start calling around to all of their data centers around the world, and they found that there was one, as you said, one domain controller backup still surviving in Ghana, because in this one Ghana data center, there had been a blackout, and not like a hacker-induced blackout, just a normal blackout, loss of power that resulted in that domain controller being offline when NotPetya hit. And so, they were able to actually, they tried to upload the Ghanaian backup to London, or rather to their Maidenhead, England's recovery operations center. They didn't have enough bandwidth, so they had to actually try to fly the Ghanaians to London, but they didn't have the right visas, so they had to fly the Ghanaians to Nigeria and then have someone meet them in the airport there and do this relay race to get this backup on a USB drive back to London and drive it to Maidenhead to begin this process of recovery. So that is the story just for Maersk. But then you have to kind of multiply out that kind of disaster to all these other companies too.
Yeah. So thank God for SneakerNet, and right, that's what helped them get back online. But that's, if anything, a case for cold backups, right? We often
exactly. And I was told that Merck, the pharmaceutical company, it's confusing Maersk and Merck, but this is Merck. Merck had a backup of all their systems, but it was a hot backup, so it was still connected when NotPetya hit. It was wiped as well. That hot backup was not good enough, and only this kind of accidental cold backup that Maersk had created with this one offline data center was what allowed them to recover. So it is a lesson in a kind of analog, resilient, backup system, just as we were talking about in some ways with the Ukraine blackout in 2015. You have to have that analog, that offline fallback. Yeah.
You'd referenced the the healthcare impact, right? That there's actually the human cost. I want to bring it back to that conversation and share this tweet here that you shared with me yesterday.
Mm-hmm. This is a Facebook post actually from a woman who was apparently having gallbladder surgery on the day of NotPetya in a Pennsylvania hospital. And that hospital was hit with NotPetya just as she was going in for surgery. And you can see here that she says that her surgery was not canceled because it didn't use the kinds of computer. It apparently didn't use computers for her procedure. But she saw other people around her have their surgeries canceled on the spot. This was a pretty rare experience. Actually, not many U.S. hospitals were directly infected with NotPetya. But many hospitals in the US face this kind of secondary effect of NotPetya, a very, very serious one, which is that they use this speech-to-text transcription software called Nuance that essentially doctors would read into this Nuance software changes to medical records that were automatically transcribed. And Nuance was taken up by NotPetya, within 24 hours, hospitals across the US, and in many cases, unwittingly, had a backlog of millions of changes to medical records that had not been made. So this is just kind of like almost like just a clerical nightmare. But now you have to imagine that, I talked to an IT administrator at one major US hospital who described how a nurse came up to her a few days after NotPetya hit and was in a panic because they had a child patient who was due for a procedure at a different hospital, but they didn't know if the child could have that procedure done because the medical record wasn't complete, wasn't up to date. So the IT administrator had to sort through all of these raw audio files that had not been transcribed, thanks to NotPetya, essentially, and make that change just in time. They managed to do it, to locate the audio, transcribe it, make the change, get the child transferred just in time for this procedure. This happened 3 more times just to that one IT administrator in the week after NotPetya. So, she was kind of haunted by this, as she described it to me, this IT administrator in a hospital, because if you do the multiplication problem, this was hundreds of hospitals across the US with hundreds or thousands of patients each. And it's very difficult to say that none of those patients had their health or actual life affected or harmed by NotPetya. I mean, we in this industry have, I think, dreaded the day when a cyber attack is confirmed to have cost a human life, but it could very well be that NotPetya was that lethal cyber attack, but we don't know because of the sheer scale of it.
Yeah. Should we talk about your research into the organization behind it? After, and how you kind of piece that together? And
sure, yeah. I don't want to
it's always hard, right?
Include questions from listeners, but I'll try to say it quickly because I want to give people a chance to ask questions. If you're cool.
Let me look at this.
So in the kind of last section of the book, it's the story of me trying to figure out who Sandworm is, to hold accountable the actual people who carried out these really terrible attacks. And I of course am in that detective story, I'm really just leaning on the excellent work of researchers at places like FireEye and Kaspersky and ESET and CrowdStrike, many places who do amazing threat intelligence. And ultimately it was FireEye who would give me the clues to make this connection. I'm not sure if I guess it's okay to spoil this, but it's, I had come to believe well into this, pretty early in this process, that Sandworm was probably the GRU, Russia's military intelligence agency, who of course are also responsible for everything from the interference in 2016 election in the US to the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal with Novichok, nerve gas, nerve poison, and the downing of MH17, the civilian aircraft over Ukraine. I mean, the GRU have their fingerprints on so many of these insanely reckless and terrible things that the Russian government has done. But yes, ultimately it was only after another attack we haven't talked about on the 2018 Winter Olympics that some forensic clues from that attack would link back to the attacks on the 2016 election, which had, thanks to the investigation of the FBI and Robert Mueller, we knew something about the people involved in that. They had released an indictment of 12 GRU hackers. And the result was that I could connect the dots to say that Sandworm probably was Unit 74455 of the GRU. There's one group within the GRU. And I even, thanks to Robert Mueller, we know like some of the faces of the people in that group, their names, even their address. And I would even I went to the headquarters of Unit 74455 in Moscow, just to kind of like see how close I could get to this group that I had been tracking at that point for years. But it was all just a theory. Like it wasn't confirmed that Sandworm was Unit 74455 until just February of this year, when the US and UK governments finally confirmed this theory that yes, that is exactly who Sandworm is. They actually were responding to another attack that Sandworm had carried out in the country of Georgia, and they not only confirmed Sandworm is this part of the GRU, is Unit 74455, is based at this address, the same building that I had gone to, but they also said that this is unacceptable, that Russia cannot carry out these kinds of attacks even on its neighbors who are not in NATO. And that to me was a kind of like, it's not in the book, it happened after the book came out, but it was very gratifying because it's a sign that things are changing. That I don't know if anybody like listened to me in the US government. They did, I should say, the State Department, like before they put this out, gave me a tip that they were about to do it. I think to kind of say like, we heard you on this, we're like trying to, we're listening. But this policy is changing. We are no longer, I hope, turning a blind eye to this kind of like abuse with impunity of Russia's neighbors whenever the GRU feels like wiping out their digital, civilian lives.
Good. I was looking at the questions in here. Some of them are, roughly to, how do I prevent this? Talking about manual backup processes used without the internet, and then disconnecting to interrupt those attacks. Certainly, in terms of when I look at best practices and what's being recommended, backups, having cold backup offline is critical for, I think we already talked about that. Patching the vulnerabilities, doing vulnerability management. And there's others. Ideally, you have air gaps or things offline where they could be, but there's also very overwhelming business reasons to have them online in some fashion.
Right.
And so, an increasingly popular control for that is, like a zero trust type architecture or microsegmentation. And I picked up that microsegmentation was one of the action items that Maersk had on their to-do list. But even a year later, right? Can you talk about that?
I try not to blame the victims too much in this book. Like, and Maersk was, absolutely a victim, and it seems cruel to like point this out. But in talking to Maersk sources, like some of them were quite angry themselves that the Maersk IT division had actually come up with a whole revamp of their IT security and wanted to like fix, their patching processes, upgrade everybody to like a new version of Windows, and create better segmentation in the network. And ultimately, that last one I think was the one that, and I should say, this didn't happen. Like the IT division ultimately didn't carry it forward. Some people told me that the reason was that it wasn't built into their bonuses, so they weren't incentivized to actually get it done. So even though the plan was written and greenlit and everything, it never happened. And it's just tragic because especially that segmentation would have probably, I think it's the only thing. Better patching may have helped too, but network segmentation is probably the number one thing that could have limited the damage from NotPetya. Like if you can keep your MEDOC, Ukrainian accounting software, segmented somewhere, quarantined, then you're going to be okay. Like it's difficult to know what piece of software is going to mutate in that fashion into a piece of malware through some malicious supply chain attack. That's very hard to predict. But yeah, if you the less you trust every one of those applications, the better off you are.
Yeah, and in terms of knowing where the bad apple is in your network, I mean, I think on last count, there's anywhere from 10 to 20,000 vulnerabilities disclosed publicly per year.
Yeah, I mean,
it's staggering.
This is your job, not mine, to like tell people how to protect themselves from these attacks. Because I don't know. I didn't want to like throw up my hands entirely, but I do think that like it's very, very difficult, and the actual like defense is an eternal problem. Like it can't be solved definitively. What I kind of like keep coming back to in the book is that there is also deterrence. That the U.S. prior to NotPetya should have said to Russia, "What you're doing is not okay. There's going to be consequences. We're going to indict your hackers. We're going to put sanctions on you," which they eventually did, but 9 months after NotPetya. You got to like send a message to Russia that deters them, that stops this bad behavior. That's what I think we were kind of like owed by our government that we didn't get. The protection problem is so endless and difficult that I kind of just touch on it in the book, but I'll leave it to professionals like you to actually tell people what to do.
Yeah. Well, there's no lack of professionals, out there with advice. But I think the role you're playing is really critical to really connect the line, the dots, so that we can see the direction this is going. And maybe another question that we can touch on lightly is the sense that I'll just show this up here because I think as we're rolling towards the end of the hour, I want to share a little bit of art, because art's another way of interpreting history for us. You want to talk about the
it's interesting that you bring this up. I didn't make this connection in my book, but I think it's a really interesting one. And in fact, when I was working on the book, I talked to Peter Singer, who is himself like this kind of warfare futurist, cyber war expert, and he drew this analogy to Guernica, which is what this painting depicts. Like Guernica, this is not my expertise, but this is like Guernica was, I think, early in the Spanish Civil War, was bombed in an air raid, and right, is this correct? Like
1936. It was actually the Germans that came in support of the Franco regime during that.
Right.
And, they just carpet bombed a whole village of innocent civilians who had no strategic. There was no strategic value to the militarily for that region, and people were lost. A lot of people lost their lives. And so that was
it's a horrific story. And Peter's point, when he brought up to me, and he was quite upset with me that I didn't include it in the book, this metaphor, because it is very apt in some ways. Like Guernica was the demonstration of a new kind of power, like a new sort of attack in a different domain. It was air power being used in a way that nobody was ready for, and it was used in a terrible, brazen, unacceptable way against civilians. And here, in the story of Sandworm, I don't want to, Ukrainians generally, I don't want to say nobody lost their life as a result of these cyber attacks. It's not clear, but it's not, like a massacre like Guernica. But it is analogous in the sense that like this was a new kind of attack in a new domain against civilians, and it was a demonstration of like how we are not prepared for this new domain of warfare, especially when it is done in this totally unrestricted way against civilians. And I hope that the analogy won't continue, because Guernica was like a presaged World War II where air power was used against, both against the Allies and the Axis in ways that were, incredibly destructive of human life, like absolute atrocities were committed on each side, I would say. And I hope that we never come to that in cyber war.
Well, it was one of our listeners is commenting that it was practice for the Blitzkrieg, and I think we've clearly, in a digital sense, crossed that Rubicon of attacking civilian infrastructure. We've seen that just the spillover effect or the lack of targeting has resulted in that. So the impact is inevitable. I want to maybe, as we wrap up here, I know we're coming up on the hour, but I want to give you a chance to talk about the notion of resilience and how do we address prevention and planning. Like, can you talk about that and kind of bring us home?
Yeah. One of the last chapters of this book, I spend time with Dan Gear at In-Q-Tel, who lives on a farm off the grid. Even his tractor has no computers in it, and he advocates this. He is the one who came up with this idea that, like, what we really need is an analog fallback. That we are the last generation that has that. We've inherited it. We need to maintain it, or we're essentially like going off into a future that has no safety net from these kinds of apocalyptic cyber attacks. And I think that it's a compelling idea. And it applies. It's not just like about the offline backup we were talking about. It also, it's like maybe we need to have an emergency steering wheel and driverless cars. Maybe we need to like have paper ballots so that when the vote is corrupted, we have a kind of ground truth and analog that we can fall back to. I think it's a maxim that you can apply to lots of things. And as I said, like, defense is so difficult, and maybe resilience, this idea of recovery, of withstanding attack, that's maybe something that we can achieve.
Yeah, it goes into the design, right? I think that's where, of how we architect the systems that we interact with every day. And you had this nice analogy about escalators instead of elevators.
Right. I mean, it's like you have to imagine when something breaks, like, what do you do? And if if your elevator breaks, you're stuck in a box, and if your escalator breaks, then you walk down the stairs, basically. And I think we can maybe like try to. I think it's a good general principle to try to build systems that work that way. And I think especially with like Internet of Things devices, which is such a security mess, where attacks really are happening, where things are very vulnerable. I think we have to imagine that, like, if the digital component of your light bulb is in need of a software update, it should still produce incandescence. Like, that's a good principle for life.
Fail on, right? So
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. Well, thank you for that. I just got the notice that we are running over, and so we have maybe like one more minute to close up on this. And I think we're clearly in a different phase of humanity. We have new evolutions that are happening. Some of them challenge us to the core, and it's important for us to really address them eyes wide open and understanding that there's multiple levels here, right? At the technical level of vulnerabilities and exploits and how things are developed at that level, but also the political aspects that you brought up. And
definitely. And I guess if there's like one lesson one point that I want to leave people with from this book, is that we need to actually pay attention to these conflicts around the world in a way that we didn't in the past, because geography has changed, the rules have changed. We are all at the doorstep of our adversary, the way that Ukraine, this borderland, as you said, has been at the doorstep of its adversary for years. Like, we are Ukraine now, and we have to learn lessons that Ukraine has already learned, or we're going to have to learn them ourselves, in a much more costly way.
Wow, it's hard to top that. We are Ukraine. I think that's a great message, that we're all connected. And Andy, I want to thank you so much for your graciousness and your time and sharing your incredible work with the community.
Well, thank you, Rick. This has been so much fun. I really appreciate it. It was a great conversation. I'd love to do it again anytime.
Awesome. I think, given that we're 61 days away from another, election,
I don't want to do it again in that sense. I don't want to have new stories to tell in that regard.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I think this is probably the gift that keeps on giving in this digital world. So again, thank you everybody for joining. And we will follow up and hand it over to you, Haley, to wrap it up. Oh, wait, no, she's not online anymore. My bad. It's me, I guess.
Haley. Yeah. Well, thank you, Rick. I really appreciate it. It's been fun. And thanks everybody for watching.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. And if you don't have it yet, we'll get you a copy of this book, signed book by the man here, Andy Greenberg. So look for the email from us, looking for your physical address, right? So we're crossing digital to physical here, and we'll send you a copy of the book at our cost as a thank you. So thank you, everybody. Be well, be smart, stay safe.